You worked for more than 40 years, Mom, and this is what you have to show for it. Melissa said it across her dining room table on a Sunday afternoon, with 8 people close enough to hear every word. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Jason gave a short laugh from beside her, and my son Daniel suddenly became very interested in the coffee cup in front of him. I was 63 years old, and until that moment, I had never realized how easily the people you love can turn your entire life into a judgment based on the car in your driveway. Melissa's house outside Columbus was beautiful. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, quartz countertops, a finished basement, and a 3-car garage that somehow never had enough room for 3 cars. She and Jason had bought it 4 years earlier, and every time I visited, something had changed. New patio furniture. New kitchen appliances. New landscaping. That afternoon, Jason had spent 20 minutes explaining the features in his new sport utility vehicle before asking whether my 12-year-old sedan was still running. Perfectly, I said. 112,000 miles and nothing serious except brakes and tires. You could upgrade, Evelyn, he said. You deserve something nicer. I like my car. Melissa smiled in that patient way people sometimes smile when they think you are pretending not to want something you cannot afford. Mom, liking something and settling for something are not always the same. I let it go. I had become good at letting things go. After my husband, Robert, died 6 years earlier, everyone expected me to make dramatic changes. Melissa thought I should sell my small ranch house and move into a newer condo. Jason suggested I lease a luxury crossover because maintenance would be predictable. Friends encouraged cruises and expensive vacations. Instead, I stayed in the house Robert and I had bought 29 years earlier. I kept driving the car I had paid off years ago. I replaced things when they stopped working, not when advertisements told me they looked old. Apparently, that had become evidence in a case I did not know my family was building against me. The conversation at lunch started because Melissa mentioned retirement. I had retired the previous spring after more than 37 years as an administrative coordinator for a regional manufacturing company. My job had never sounded impressive at parties. I managed schedules, purchase orders, vendor records, payroll reports, and enough spreadsheets to last several lifetimes. I earned a decent salary, raised 2 children with Robert, and never imagined anyone would someday measure those years by the badge on my car. Are you getting by okay? Melissa asked. I am doing fine. Fine can mean a lot of things. It means fine. Jason leaned back. Have you ever thought about selling the house before you have to? I looked at him. Have to. Maintenance gets expensive. Property taxes go up. You could free up some cash. The house is manageable. For now, Melissa said. Daniel finally looked up. Mom has lived there forever. She knows what it costs. I am trying to think ahead, Melissa replied. Somebody has to. That sentence bothered me more than I showed. I have been thinking ahead since before you were born, I said. Jason smiled. Nobody is saying you have not. But retirement is different. You do not have a paycheck anymore. I am aware. Melissa touched my wrist. We just do not want you struggling quietly because you are too proud to tell us. There was affection in her voice, which somehow made the assumption harder to challenge. They genuinely believed I needed protecting from my own financial decisions. I am not struggling, I said. Jason glanced toward the window where my silver sedan sat beside his new vehicle. Then maybe enjoy some of what you worked for. I smiled. I do. Mom, you never go anywhere expensive. You still clip grocery coupons. You waited 6 months to replace that old refrigerator. The refrigerator still worked. Jason laughed. That is exactly what I mean. Then Melissa said something about how different my life was from what she had imagined for me. I asked what she had imagined. She hesitated. Jason did not. Success, I guess. The table became quiet. Daniel frowned. That was unnecessary. Jason lifted both hands. I did not mean it like that. How did you mean it? I asked. He looked uncomfortable now, but Melissa answered for him. Mom, nobody thinks you are a failure. From the other end of the table, one of Jason's relatives quietly said, that is basically what this conversation sounds like. Melissa sighed. I am saying she deserves more. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. More what? Nobody answered immediately. More house, I supposed. More car. More vacations photographed from hotel balconies. More visible proof that my life had counted. Jason finally said, you worked your whole life. There should be something to show for it. I looked around the table and realized they had already decided there was not. They saw my old car. They saw my modest house. They saw the cardigan I had owned for 7 years. What they did not see was that my mortgage had been gone for nearly a decade. They did not see the retirement contributions that had left every paycheck before I could spend them. They did not see the emergency savings Robert and I had built slowly, or the investments I had continued after he died. They did not know because I had never considered my bank statement's family entertainment. Maybe I am a failure by your definition, I said. Melissa immediately shook her head. Mom, that is not what I meant. It is all right. And strangely, it was. I did not feel embarrassed anymore. I felt curious about how confidently people could judge a life from its packaging. I stood, carried my plate to the kitchen, and thanked Melissa for lunch. Before I left, Daniel followed me to the driveway. Mom, are you okay? I am fine. Jason was out of line. He believes what he believes. Daniel glanced at my car. You could have corrected them. I opened the driver's door. About what? He looked at me for a moment, then smiled slightly. I do not know. I just have the feeling there is something they do not know. I smiled back. There are many things people do not know when they never bother to ask. The next morning, I placed a folder of documents on my kitchen table and checked the appointment written on my calendar. Thursday, 10:30 in the morning. Reynolds Community Bank. Thomas. Reynolds, branch manager. I had made the appointment 2 weeks earlier for a financial transaction that had nothing to do with Melissa or Jason. At least, that was what I believed until my phone rang and Melissa told me she and Jason had an appointment at the same bank, on the same morning. Melissa's call lasted less than 5 minutes, but it told me more than she realized. She said she and Jason were meeting with someone at Reynolds Community Bank on Thursday morning and wondered whether I wanted to ride with them since my appointment was at the same branch. I have my car, I said. Mom, I know you have a car. She sounded amused. I just thought it would be easier. I will meet you there. After we hung up, I looked around my kitchen. The cabinets were 20 years old, the refrigerator Melissa had complained about was finally new, and the oak table had a scratch Robert made while repairing a lamp when Daniel was in high school. Nothing in that room would impress Jason. That was fine with me. The house had 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and about 1,400 square feet. Robert and I bought it when Melissa was 9 and Daniel was 6. For years, nearly every extra dollar went somewhere practical. Braces. School clothes. Car repairs. College savings. A new furnace. Then, as our incomes improved, we began sending extra money toward the mortgage. When Robert died, there was no loan attached to the house. I remember sitting at this same table after his funeral with a stack of documents and realizing that grief was difficult enough without wondering how I would make next month's payment. That feeling of security mattered more to me than granite countertops ever could. I opened the folder prepared for Thursday. Inside were account summaries, identification documents, tax records, and paperwork related to a small parcel of property about 6 miles from my house. The parcel was just under 5 acres, mostly open ground with mature trees along one edge and an old storage building near the road. I had been considering buying it for almost a year. Robert and I used to talk about having a little more land someday, somewhere I could grow vegetables, plant fruit, trees, and maybe build a workshop large enough for Daniel to use when he visited. I was not trying to become a developer. I simply liked the property, and the owner was ready to sell. The agreed price was reasonable, and I had already decided how I wanted to pay for it. No loan. No monthly payment. No financial drama. Just a transfer from funds I had specifically set aside without touching the money supporting my retirement. I closed the folder and thought about Sunday's conversation. Melissa had asked whether I was getting by. The phrase stayed with me because I knew she meant well. She had watched me use coupons and assumed necessity. She had seen me compare prices and assumed limitation. What she never understood was that habits do not disappear when circumstances improve. Robert and I learned early that $1 spent carelessly could never be invested later. We were not extreme about it. We ate out. We took vacations. We bought birthday presents and enjoyed Christmas. But we never treated spending as proof that we were doing well. When I received raises at work, I increased my retirement contributions before increasing anything else. When the mortgage disappeared, I redirected much of that old payment into savings and investments. When my car loan ended, I kept transferring part of the same amount into a separate account. That was how ordinary money became meaningful over time. There was no dramatic inheritance behind it. Robert left me his portion of what we had built together, but we had built it from paychecks, not family wealth. My parents had been working-class people. His parents were the same. Everything accumulated slowly. Apparently, slow success was difficult to recognize from the outside. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel stopped by after work. He brought coffee and found me trimming dead branches from a maple tree near the driveway. Still recovering from Sunday, he asked. "There is nothing to recover from." Melissa called me. I looked at him. "Why?" "She thinks she upset you." "She did." Daniel waited. "But being upset is not the same as being damaged." He smiled. "That sounds like something Dad would have said." We went inside, and he noticed my folder on the kitchen counter. Bank appointment. Thursday. Melissa said they are going to. Apparently. Daniel hesitated. They are trying to get financing. I looked at him. For what? Jason wants to buy into a commercial property with one of his business partners. Melissa said it is a great opportunity. How much? She did not tell me. Then I hope they have done their homework. Daniel took a drink of coffee. You really are not curious about their private finances? No. They seem pretty curious about yours. That does not mean I have to return the favor. He laughed, then became serious. Mom, when Jason said there should be something to show for all those years, why did you not tell him the house is paid off? Because he did not ask whether the house was paid off. He looked at it and decided it was not impressive. What about your retirement accounts? Those are none of his business. Daniel nodded slowly. Fair enough. Then he noticed a brochure partly visible beneath my paperwork. What is that? I slid it toward him. It showed the 5-acre property. He studied the photograph, then looked at me. Are you buying land? I am considering completing the purchase Thursday. His eyebrows rose. Does Melissa know? No. Jason? No. Are you financing it? No. Daniel stared at me for several seconds before laughing quietly. I knew it. Knew what? That Sunday conversation was ridiculous. Do not turn this into a competition. I am not. He handed the brochure back. But they think you are worried about grocery money. That is their assumption. And you are about to buy 5 acres without a loan. If everything checks out. Daniel shook his head, smiling. Thursday might be interesting. I put the brochure back into the folder. Only if someone makes it interesting. 2 days later, I pulled into Reynolds Community Bank at 10:15 in the morning. Melissa and Jason were already there. Jason's new sport utility vehicle was parked near the entrance. Melissa stood beside it holding a leather document case. When she saw my sedan, she waved. Jason glanced at his watch. "Perfect timing," he said as I approached. "Our loan meeting is at 10:32. I adjusted the folder under my arm. "So is mine." Jason smiled sympathetically. "Do not worry, Evelyn. If you need help understanding anything they offer you, I deal with financing all the time." Before I could answer, the glass doors opened and Thomas Reynolds stepped outside. He saw me immediately, smiled, and walked past Jason with his hand extended toward me. "Evelyn," he said warmly, "I have everything prepared. We should be able to complete your purchase today." Thomas Reynolds had been managing that branch for nearly 15 years, and I had known him long enough to recognize when he was being deliberately careful. He shook my hand, greeted Melissa and Jason politely, then held the door open for us. "I did not realize you were all together," he said. "Family," Melissa answered. "Mom mentioned she had some banking business today too." Thomas glanced at my folder. "Yes, we have been working on the details for a little while." Jason looked at me. "You have?" "A few weeks," I said. Inside, the bank looked much as it always had: polished tile floors, a row of teller windows, several offices behind glass partitions, and a coffee station near the waiting area. Nothing dramatic. Still, Melissa seemed surprised when 2 employees greeted me by name before we reached Thomas's office. One of the tellers asked whether I had decided what fruit trees I wanted for the property. "Not yet," I said. "I am thinking apples and pears." Melissa stopped walking. "Property? We can talk later." Thomas opened his office door. "Evelyn, your closing documents are ready, but there is one final verification I want to review with you." Then he looked toward Melissa and Jason. "I believe your appointment is with our commercial lending specialist, but she is finishing another meeting. You are welcome to wait here for a few minutes if Evelyn is comfortable with that." "Of course," I said. Melissa sat beside me. Jason took the chair nearest Thomas's desk. He placed his leather portfolio across his knees and immediately began talking about the commercial property he hoped to buy with his business partner. The project was larger than Daniel had suggested. Jason wanted to purchase a minority interest in a small retail building north of Columbus, and he needed financing for his portion. He spoke confidently about appreciation, rental income, and future refinancing. Thomas listened without commenting on the merits of the deal. "Our commercial lending department will review all of that with you," he said. "They will also need the updated documentation requested earlier this week." Jason's confidence shifted slightly. "We brought most of it." Melissa looked at him. "Most?" "There are a couple statements I still need to download." Thomas simply nodded. "They will tell you what is required." Then he turned toward me and opened a file. "Evelyn, the title review is complete. No issues were identified with the parcel. The seller's closing agent confirmed the final amount this morning." He slid a document toward me. I read it carefully. Melissa leaned slightly in my direction before catching herself. "What parcel?" she asked. I looked at her. 5 acres outside town. Her eyes widened. "You are buying 5 acres. That is the plan." Jason smiled as if the mystery had suddenly become understandable. "Oh, investment property. That makes sense. What kind of loan are you looking at?" "I am not." He paused. "You are paying cash." Thomas did not answer for me. I appreciated that. "I am using funds I set aside for the purchase," I said. Melissa stared at me. "Mom, how much is this costing?" "Enough that I reviewed it carefully." "But should you be spending retirement money on land?" "I am not spending my retirement money." Jason shifted in his chair. Evelyn, land can tie up liquidity. Depending on what they are offering you, financing might actually make more sense. Thomas remained silent. Nobody is offering me financing, I said. Because I did not ask for any. I know, but sometimes using leverage is smarter than draining cash reserves. I looked at him. I am not draining my cash reserves either. For the first time that morning, Jason had nothing immediate to say. Thomas placed another page in front of me. This confirms the transfer instructions you authorized. Please verify the destination information before signing. I read every line. Robert used to tease me because I read contracts as if someone had hidden a riddle inside them. I had spent too many years processing purchase orders to sign anything I had not checked. Melissa watched me. Mom, why did you never mention this? I was not hiding it. The purchase was not final. You could have told us you were looking. I could have. She understood the rest without my saying it. She could also have asked about my life without assuming she already knew it. A woman appeared at Thomas's door and introduced herself as the commercial lending specialist. She told Melissa and Jason she was ready for them. Jason stood, but before leaving, he looked at the documents on Thomas's desk. I still think you should compare financing options before moving that much money, he told me. At your age, preserving capital matters. Melissa gave him a look. Jason. I am trying to help. I know, I said. But I have already reviewed the decision with Thomas and my financial advisor. Jason glanced at Thomas. And you think paying cash is a good idea? Thomas answered carefully. My role is not to discuss Evelyn's private financial circumstances without her authorization. I can tell you that we reviewed the mechanics of this transaction and that Evelyn understands what she is doing. Jason gave a small shrug. Fair enough. He and Melissa followed the lending specialist across the hall. Through the glass wall, I could see them sitting at a conference table. Thomas waited until their door closed. Then he looked at me. Do they really think you are having financial trouble? I smiled. Apparently my car has been sending the wrong message. He laughed quietly. That car will probably outlive all of us. That is what I keep telling them. His expression became serious. You handled that well. There was nothing to handle. There might be soon. I followed his gaze toward the conference room. Jason was searching through his portfolio while Melissa looked increasingly concerned. Their finances are none of my business, I said. Correct. Thomas tapped my document. And yours are none of theirs unless you decide otherwise. I signed the transfer. Authorization. Exactly. 20 minutes later, my transaction was complete. The property closing still required signatures with the title company that afternoon, but the funds were verified and ready. I thanked Thomas and gathered my papers. As I stepped into the hallway, Melissa came out of the conference room alone. Her face had changed. Mom, she said quietly, can I ask you something? Of course. She looked toward Thomas's office, then back at me. Jason told them we might be able to use your house as additional support if we needed family backing. I stared at her. My house. He thought you still had a mortgage and maybe there was some equity available. Before I could answer, Jason stepped into the hallway. It was only an idea, he said. Nobody submitted anything. I held my folder against my side. You discussed using my home for your loan without asking me. Not using it. Just whether family assets could strengthen the application. My home is not a family asset. Jason exhaled. Evelyn, I am not trying to take anything from you. Then we agree. He looked relieved too soon. My house will not be part of your financing. Melissa nodded immediately. Of course. Jason's frustration showed. I was only exploring options. Besides, if the house is still financed, the bank probably could not use much of it anyway. Thomas had stepped into the hallway behind me. He heard the comment but said nothing. Jason continued, "That is what I was trying to explain Sunday. At some point we have to be realistic about what everybody actually has." I looked at Thomas, then at Melissa. For the first time, I considered whether silence was still serving any useful purpose. Thomas did not say anything, but the silence in that hallway changed. Jason looked from him to me, apparently waiting for someone to agree that his assumption about my house was reasonable. I had spent most of my life avoiding unnecessary arguments, but there is a difference between keeping peace and allowing someone to build plans around property that does not belong to them. "Thomas," I said, "I am comfortable with you confirming whether there is currently a mortgage on my home." His expression remained professional. "Only that?" "Only that." He nodded. "Mrs. Carter's residence is owned free and clear. There is no mortgage loan secured by the property through this bank, and based on the documentation she has authorized us to review for her planning, there is no outstanding mortgage elsewhere." Jason blinked. Melissa turned toward me. "Your house is completely paid off. It has been for almost 10 years. 10 years? Almost." She looked genuinely confused. "Why did I think you still had a mortgage?" "I do not know. You never told me. You never asked." Jason recovered more quickly. "That is great, Evelyn. Seriously. That actually means there is substantial equity available if you ever wanted to use it strategically." I looked at him. "You heard the part where I said my house will not support your loan. I am not suggesting that now. I am talking generally. Generally, I prefer owning my home without owing anyone against it." Thomas gave the smallest nod and said nothing. Jason glanced toward the conference room where the lending specialist was waiting. "Different philosophies, I guess." "Yes," I said. "Very different." Melissa touched Jason's arm. "We should finish our meeting." Before they returned to the conference room, she looked back at me. "Are you leaving?" "I have a title appointment this afternoon." "For the land?" "Yes." "Can we talk afterward?" "Of course." Thomas and I returned to his office because I needed copies of the transfer confirmation. While the printer worked, he leaned back in his chair. "You know I would never have discussed the mortgage without your permission." "I know. And I will not discuss anything else unless you specifically authorize it. That is why I have banked here for so long." He smiled. "That and our excellent free coffee." "Your coffee is terrible." "Then loyalty remains unexplained." I laughed, and the tension finally eased. He handed me the documents. "Congratulations on the property." "Thank you." Robert would have liked it. Thomas had known my husband through the bank and several local business groups. He would already be pricing tractors we did not need. And building a storage shed. Twice the necessary size. Exactly. I put the papers into my folder and stood. Through the glass wall, I could see Melissa listening while Jason spoke to the lending specialist. His posture was different now. Less relaxed. He was no longer presenting an opportunity. He was answering questions. I reminded myself that whatever happened in that room belonged to them. Their loan application was not my victory or my problem. I left the bank and drove to the title company. By 3:30 that afternoon, the signatures were complete. 5 acres of Ohio ground, an aging storage building, a line of maple trees, and more weeds than I cared to count officially belonged to me. I stood near the property entrance afterward with the keys in my hand and felt something I had not expected. Not excitement exactly. Peace. I could afford the purchase without changing my monthly retirement plan, borrowing against my home, or asking either of my children for help. That was what all those ordinary decisions had purchased for me. Not status. Options. Melissa called while I was still there. "Where are you?" "At the property." "You actually closed today?" "I did." "Can Jason and I come see it?" I hesitated, then gave her the address. They arrived about 30 minutes later in Jason's sport utility vehicle. Melissa stepped out first and slowly looked across the open ground. "This is beautiful. It needs work." "That building needs more than work," Jason said, pointing toward the old storage structure. "Probably." He walked toward the tree line, estimating distances the way people in real estate often do. Melissa stayed beside me. "Mom, I owe you an apology." "For Sunday?" "For more than Sunday." She looked toward my car. "I really thought you were barely getting by." "I know. And you let me think that." "Melissa, I did not create the assumption." She absorbed that without arguing. "How did you pay off the house so early?" "Your father and I made extra principal payments for years. After you and Daniel finished college, we increased them." "Why did you never celebrate it?" "We did. We ordered pizza and opened a bottle of wine." She laughed despite herself. "That sounds exactly like you and Dad." Jason returned from the edge of the property. "There could be real value here if zoning allows future development." "I am planting fruit trees," I said. "You paid for 5 acres to plant apples." "Among other things." He shook his head, smiling. "You really do think differently about money." "Apparently." Then his expression became more serious. "The bank wants additional documentation before they decide on our application. I hope it works out. We may need to restructure some things." "Then take your time." He studied me. "You are not going to ask what?" "No." That seemed to surprise him more than learning my house was paid off. "Why not?" "Because your finances belong to you until you decide to share them." Melissa looked down. She understood the contrast immediately. On the drive home, I thought that might be the end of it. They knew the house was paid off. They knew I could purchase land without financing. Surely that was enough to correct the picture they had formed of me. I underestimated how difficult it can be for people to abandon a story once they have spent years believing it. Sunday evening, Melissa invited me to dinner again. Daniel was there this time. Everything remained pleasant until Jason began explaining the delay with his commercial loan. He described lending standards, debt ratios, and documentation requirements, then turned toward me and said, "You were lucky to buy that land without dealing with all this." I set down my fork. "Lucky? You know what I mean. A straightforward cash purchase is simpler." "It is simpler. Not everybody can leave money sitting around unused for years." Daniel looked at him. "I do not think that money was unused." Jason sighed. "I am not criticizing her." Melissa said quietly, "It sounds like you are." He looked around the table. "Fine. Evelyn made conservative choices. They worked for her. I am building something bigger." I could have ignored it again. Then he added, "There is a difference between being financially cautious and actually being financially successful." Daniel leaned back in disbelief. Melissa closed her eyes. I looked at Jason and realized the paid-off house and 5 acres had changed nothing. He still needed my life to be smaller than his. The following morning, Thomas called me about one final administrative document related to the property transfer. Before we hung up, he said, "Evelyn, I hope I did not overstep Thursday. You did exactly what I authorized." "Good." I looked through my kitchen window toward the driveway and thought about Jason's comment. "Thomas, I may need to stop by again this week." "Anytime. And if my family is with me, I might authorize you to explain a little more than I did Thursday." There was a brief pause. "Only what you specifically approve." "That is exactly what I want." The next few days gave me plenty of time to reconsider what I had said to Thomas. Part of me wondered whether revealing anything more would simply turn a private matter into a family scoreboard. I had never wanted Melissa or Daniel to measure themselves against my bank accounts, and I certainly did not want Jason thinking that money gave one person the right to look down on another. But another part of me understood that this was no longer only about correcting an assumption. Jason had considered my house a possible resource for his business financing before asking me. He had repeatedly described my choices as evidence of limited success. If I continued saying nothing, I risked allowing that attitude to become normal. On Wednesday morning, Melissa called and asked whether I could meet her at the bank Friday afternoon. Jason needed to submit additional paperwork, and she wanted me there because she hoped we could talk afterward. "Is this about their loan?" I asked. "Partly. I am not signing anything." "I know. I promise. Nobody is asking you to." Her voice sounded tired. "I just think we need to clear the air." I agreed. Friday afternoon, I arrived at Reynolds Community Bank shortly before 2. Melissa was already sitting in the lobby. Jason arrived several minutes later carrying the same leather portfolio. His confidence had returned, although not completely. "Good to see you, Evelyn," he said. "Melissa said you wanted to talk." "Melissa asked me to come." "Right." Thomas stepped from his office and invited us inside. I had called him that morning and given very specific instructions. He could confirm the status of my home, the land purchase, and certain broad facts about my financial position. He was not authorized to disclose exact account balances, account numbers, investment holdings, or anything unrelated to the conversation. I wanted clarity, not spectacle. Once we were seated, Melissa spoke first. "Mom, I want to apologize again. I have been thinking about Sunday and everything I assumed about you." "Thank you." She looked at Jason. He cleared his throat. "I probably came across more judgmental than I intended. You called my choices conservative and suggested they were different from being financially successful. I was talking about growth. You were talking about me." He looked down briefly. "Fair." Thomas remained quiet. Melissa turned toward me. "You said you might be willing to explain more." "I am." I looked at Thomas. "You have my permission to confirm the points we discussed this morning." Thomas folded his hands on the desk. "All right. Mrs. Carter has authorized me to clarify several matters because there appears to have been some misunderstanding. First, her primary residence has been owned free and clear for nearly 10 years. Second, the 5-acre parcel purchased last week was acquired without financing. Third, the funds used for that purchase did not require Mrs. Carter to withdraw money from the retirement account supporting her normal income." Jason nodded slowly. "I understand that." "There is one additional point," Thomas said. "Mrs. Carter's financial planning has been conducted with this institution and outside advisors for many years. Her spending decisions should not be interpreted as evidence that she lacks financial resources." Jason shifted in his chair. "Nobody said she had nothing." Melissa looked at him. "We basically did." Thomas continued in the same calm tone. "I cannot discuss confidential balances, nor would that be appropriate. But because Mrs. Carter has specifically authorized me to say this, I can confirm that she is not living paycheck to paycheck, she is not dependent on her children for financial support, and she has maintained substantial reserves beyond ordinary monthly expenses." Jason gave a short nod. "That is good. I am glad." Something about his tone suggested he still believed the difference was merely that I had saved a little more than expected. I could have stopped there. Instead, I asked him a question. "Jason, when you said there should be something to show for 40 years of work, what did you mean?" He hesitated. I already apologized for how that sounded. "I am not asking you to apologize. I am asking what you meant." He leaned back. "A comfortable retirement. Assets. Investments. Freedom to do things without worrying about every dollar. That is a reasonable definition." "Exactly. Then why did you assume I did not have those things?" His eyes moved toward Melissa. "Because you live so modestly." "So modestly means unsuccessful." "Not necessarily. You thought my old car meant I could not afford another one. Most people replace cars before 12 years. I could replace it tomorrow. I know that now. You thought my house was still financed. I made an assumption. You thought I used coupons because I needed to. Melissa lowered her eyes. That assumption had been hers. And you thought buying land with cash was luck. Jason exhaled. What do you want me to say, Evelyn? Before I could answer, Thomas spoke. His voice remained courteous, but there was a firmness I had rarely heard from him. Perhaps I can explain something from a banking perspective, since Mrs. Carter has authorized this discussion. Jason looked at him. Sure. Thomas leaned slightly forward. I have spent more than 20 years watching people confuse visible spending with financial strength. They are not the same thing. A newer vehicle can represent wealth, or it can represent a large monthly payment. A larger home can represent equity, or it can represent debt. Expensive vacations can represent disposable income, or they can appear on a credit card statement for years afterward. You cannot determine someone's financial position from what is parked in the driveway. Nobody spoke. Thomas continued. Mrs. Carter has done something many people find remarkably difficult. She consistently lived below her means while her income increased. She eliminated major debt, maintained emergency reserves, invested over decades, and entered retirement without needing to dramatically reduce her standard of living. That is not financial failure. Jason's expression tightened. I never used that word directly. Maybe not, Thomas said, but I believe Mrs. Carter has spent enough time defending responsible decisions that do not require a defense. Melissa looked at me, and her eyes were beginning to fill with regret. I had expected satisfaction when someone finally said those words for me. Instead, I felt something quieter. Sadness that they had needed to be said at all. Jason looked toward the window, then back at Thomas. You obviously know more about her finances than we do. Only because she entrusted me with that information professionally. Thomas paused. But I know enough to tell you this with her permission. If your definition of success includes financial independence, security, and freedom from unnecessary debt, then you have been evaluating the wrong person by the wrong evidence. Melissa reached for my hand. Mom, I am sorry. I squeezed her fingers. Jason remained silent for several seconds. Then he asked the question I had hoped he would not ask. When you say substantial reserves, how substantial are we talking? I looked at him. Enough. I am just trying to understand. No, I said gently. You are trying to find a number that tells you whether I deserve your respect. His face changed immediately. Melissa turned toward him. Thomas said nothing. I continued, if knowing that my home is paid for, my land is paid for, my retirement is secure, and I do not need financial help from anyone is not enough, then another number will not solve the problem. For once, Jason did not argue. Then the commercial lending specialist knocked on Thomas's open door and asked whether Jason had a moment. He stepped into the hallway with her. Through the glass, I watched her hand him a document. His shoulders lowered as he read it. When he returned, his face was pale with disappointment. They declined the loan, he said. Melissa stared at him. Declined it? He nodded. Our debt-to-income ratio is too high. The room became completely still. Jason looked at me, then at the folder in front of Thomas, and I knew exactly what possibility had just entered his mind. Jason did not ask me for money that afternoon. He did something more revealing. He looked at me for several seconds, looked at Thomas, then carefully closed his leather portfolio as if putting away the question before anyone could hear it. We will figure something else out, he said. Melissa was still staring at the loan decision. How did our debt-to-income ratio get that high? Jason shifted in his chair. It is not one thing. The mortgage, the vehicles, the credit cards, the home improvement loan. Melissa looked up sharply. What credit cards? The room became uncomfortable, and I immediately stood. This sounds like a conversation you two should have privately. Mom, wait, Melissa said. You do not need me here. Please. There was something in her voice that made me sit again. Jason rubbed his forehead. There is no crisis. We have balances from the kitchen renovation and some business expenses. I was planning to consolidate everything once the commercial deal closed. You told me the renovation was paid for. Most of it was. Melissa stared at him. How much is on the cards? Jason glanced toward Thomas, then at me. Can we discuss this at home? You were willing to discuss my mother's house with the bank. Her words landed harder than if she had shouted. Thomas stood. I can give you privacy. Thank you, Melissa said. After he left, Jason opened the portfolio again and pulled out several statements. I did not reach for them. I did not need the numbers. Melissa did. She read silently for almost a minute. This is more than I thought. We can manage it. Then why was the loan declined? Because lenders calculate risk differently. They calculate from the numbers we gave them. Jason looked frustrated. Melissa, I am trying to build assets. That commercial property could produce income for years. With borrowed money while we are already carrying this. That is how investing works sometimes. I remained silent until Jason turned toward me. Evelyn, you understand. You just bought land. With money I already had. Yes, but that is because you are at a different stage. That is true. If I had your liquidity, I would not need the bank either. There it was. The question he had put away was back on the table, only disguised as an observation. Melissa heard it too. Do not, she said. Jason frowned. Do not what? Ask my mother to finance your deal. I did not ask. You are walking toward it. He looked at me. I am discussing possibilities. I folded my hands. Then let me remove one possibility. I will not finance the commercial property, guarantee the loan, borrow against my house, or pledge any of my assets. Jason's jaw tightened slightly. I was not asking you to risk your house. Good. Then we agree. What if it was structured properly? A private loan with interest, legal documents, everything formal. No. You have not even heard the terms. I do not need to. Melissa looked almost relieved. Jason leaned back. I respect that it is your money. I just think there is an irony here. You have capital sitting in conservative accounts while an opportunity is available that could earn more. I smiled faintly. You still think I do not understand money because I use it differently than you. That is not what I said. It is what you keep saying. Thomas returned after knocking lightly on the door. Everything all right? Yes, I said. Jason gathered his statements. We are done. Thomas looked at me, then at Melissa. Before you leave, Mrs. Carter, I have the final confirmation from your property transaction. He handed me an envelope. Thank you. Jason stood, but Thomas remained beside his desk. Mr. Carter, Jason said, incorrectly using my last name for himself as he sometimes did when distracted, then corrected himself. Thomas, can I ask you something generally? Certainly. Would you agree that keeping too much cash or low-risk assets can mean missing opportunities? Thomas considered the question. Any financial strategy involves trade-offs. Exactly. But return is only one side of risk. Jason nodded impatiently. Of course. Thomas continued. And financial independence has value that does not always appear in a projected return. Jason glanced at me. I understand. Thomas looked directly at him. I am not sure you do. The room went still again. His tone was not rude. It was measured, almost instructional. Mrs. Carter did not arrive at her current position by accidentally leaving money somewhere. She made deliberate decisions for decades. She accepted slower growth in some areas to maintain stability in others. She invested consistently. She avoided carrying unnecessary consumer debt. She protected her home. Most importantly, she created enough margin that a declined loan does not determine what she can or cannot do. Jason's face reddened slightly. I am aware she has done well. Then stop speaking about her choices as though they require correction. Melissa looked at Thomas in surprise. So did I? Thomas continued, you came into this bank believing Mrs. Carter might need help understanding financing. You suggested her home could potentially strengthen your application. You assumed her modest lifestyle reflected financial weakness. Now that you know otherwise, you are suggesting her resources might be better deployed according to your strategy. At every stage, the assumption is that you understand her money better than she does. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it. Thomas softened his voice. There is nothing wrong with ambition. There is nothing wrong with borrowing responsibly. But there is also nothing unsophisticated about deciding that peace, liquidity, and independence are worth more than another investment. I had known Thomas for years, but I had never heard him speak so plainly. Jason looked down at his portfolio. Point taken. Melissa wiped beneath one eye. I think I needed to hear that too. I looked at her. Why? She took a slow breath. Because I have been doing the same thing in a different way. Every time I saw your old car, your house, your coupons, I thought I was seeing limitations. I never considered that I was looking at choices. Most of them were choices, I said. Not every year was easy. I know. There were years your father and I worried about money. There were medical bills, repairs, tuition, and months when the checking account was thinner than I liked. We were ordinary people. We just kept going. Melissa nodded. And I turned the result into something embarrassing because it did not look expensive. I reached across the desk and took her hand. You can understand something differently once you know better. Jason remained quiet. When we finally left the bank, he walked several steps behind us. In the parking lot, Melissa hugged me before going to their vehicle. Jason stopped beside my sedan. Evelyn, he said, I owe you a real apology. I waited. I thought because I took bigger financial risks, I understood money better than you. I thought your life was small because your spending looked small. He glanced toward his new sport utility vehicle. Apparently I confused payments with progress. That is an expensive confusion. He gave a humorless laugh. Yes. It is. Then he looked at me again. I will not ask you to fund the deal. Thank you. But I might ask you something else someday. What? How you and Robert learned to live this way. I opened my car door. That conversation I would be willing to have. For the first time since Robert died, someone asked me how we had built our financial life without asking how much money I had. Jason called the following Tuesday evening. Evelyn, do you have time this weekend? He asked. Probably. Why? You said you would tell me how you and Robert handled money. I was quiet for a moment. Are you asking because you want another way to finance the commercial property? No. His answer came quickly, then he corrected himself. At least, I am trying not to. Melissa and I spent most of the weekend going through everything. We need to change some things. Come over Saturday morning. At 10 o'clock Saturday, Melissa and Jason arrived carrying coffee and a yellow legal pad. I almost laughed when I saw the legal pad because Robert used to begin every serious financial conversation with one. We sat at my old kitchen table, the same table Melissa had probably considered outdated for years. Jason opened his notebook. Where do we start? With what you owe. His expression tightened. That is not exactly inspiring. Neither is a leaking roof, but pretending it is not there does not keep you dry. Melissa smiled. That sounds like Dad. He said something similar when we had to replace this roof 22 years ago. I asked them to write down every monthly obligation they had, but I told them not to show me the numbers unless they wanted to. Mortgage, vehicle payments, credit cards, home improvement loan, insurance, utilities, subscriptions, and everything else that left their checking account regularly. The list became longer than Jason expected. Some of these are small, he said. Small is fine if you chose it and can afford it. The question is whether all of them together are buying you the life you actually want. Melissa stared at the page. We earn good money. I know. Then why does it always feel like we are waiting for the next paycheck? Because income and margin are not the same thing. Jason looked up. Thomas used that word too. Margin. Robert loved that word. He said margin was the space between what life costs and what you can afford. The larger that space becomes, the harder it is for one bad month to control you. I told them about our early years when Robert and I had 2 young children and very little margin at all. We had not started wealthy. We had simply developed rules because we disliked financial uncertainty. We kept an emergency fund. We contributed to retirement accounts automatically. We avoided increasing our lifestyle every time our salaries increased. We bought reliable used cars and kept them after the loans disappeared. When we received tax refunds or bonuses, some money went toward enjoyment and some toward long-term goals. So you never bought anything unnecessary? Jason asked. Of course we did. Your father once bought a fishing boat that spent more time in our driveway than on water. Melissa laughed. I remember that boat. So do I. I reminded him about it for 15 years. Then what was different? Jason asked. We made mistakes that fit inside our finances. We did not build our finances around maintaining the mistakes. He wrote that down. I noticed but said nothing. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not once did I tell them what to sell or which debt to pay first. Those decisions belonged to them. I explained only what Robert and I had done and why. Before leaving, Melissa walked into the living room and studied the framed photograph of Robert on the bookshelf. I used to think you and Dad were just cautious because you grew up with less, she said. That was part of it. I thought being successful meant eventually not having to think about money. For me, success means being able to think about money without being afraid of it. She turned toward me. I wish I had understood that earlier. You understand it now. Over the next month, things changed quietly. Jason withdrew from the commercial property deal rather than searching for another lender. He told me the decision had embarrassed him at first, but the feeling passed when he realized he had been trying to add another obligation to a life already crowded with them. He and Melissa sold his new sport utility vehicle and replaced it with a 3-year-old model that cost far less. Melissa cancelled several subscriptions she admitted she barely used. They created a plan for the credit card balances and stopped discussing home renovations. None of those choices transformed their finances overnight. That was never how real change worked. But for the first time, they were moving in a direction instead of maintaining an appearance. Daniel heard about the Saturday conversation and called me laughing. So now you are the family financial advisor? Absolutely not. Melissa says Jason has a spreadsheet. That concerns me more than it comforts me. He told me he should have listened to you years ago. I never asked him to listen. Maybe that was the problem. You were too quiet. I thought about that after we hung up. Silence had protected my privacy, but perhaps I had confused privacy with invisibility. My children knew that Robert and I were responsible, but I had never explained the decisions behind that responsibility. Melissa had filled the empty space with assumptions. Jason had filled it with judgment. I could not blame myself for their behavior, but I could decide how openly I wanted to live going forward. A week later, Thomas called about a routine account review. At the end of our conversation, he asked how things were going with the family. Better, I said. Jason came over with a legal pad. Thomas laughed. That sounds serious. He is learning. We all are. Then he added, for what it is worth, I hope I did not embarrass him at the bank. You challenged him. There is a difference. Yes. I looked through my kitchen window at the maple leaves beginning to turn orange. And I think he needed someone outside the family to say it. Sometimes people hear truth differently when it comes from someone who has nothing to gain. The following Saturday, I drove to my 5-acre property. Daniel was already there repairing the old storage building. Melissa and Jason arrived later carrying 2 young apple trees in the back of their vehicle. Jason climbed out and smiled. "We thought you should start the orchard." We planted the first tree near the eastern edge of the field and the second about 20 feet away. When we finished, Melissa brushed soil from her gloves and looked across the property. "Mom, can I ask one more financial question?" "You can ask." "Do you regret not spending more when you were younger?" I looked toward Daniel, then at Melissa, then across the land Robert and I had once imagined owning someday. "Sometimes," I said. "There were trips we could have taken. Things we could have enjoyed. Being careful can become its own habit, and not every dollar needs a job 20 years from now." Jason smiled. "So there is hope for me. Do not get excited." Everyone laughed. Then I added, "But I do not regret buying freedom before I bought appearances." Melissa became quiet. Jason looked toward the 2 small trees we had just planted. A month earlier, he had believed my modest life represented failure. Now he was standing on land I owned outright, asking how to build the kind of security he had once assumed I lacked. And strangely, that reversal no longer felt like winning. It felt like something better. My family was finally learning that success was not about proving who had the most. It was about reaching a place where you no longer needed to prove anything at all. Over the next several weeks, the changes in our family became visible in small ways rather than dramatic ones. Melissa stopped apologizing every time money came up. Jason stopped explaining every purchase as an investment. Daniel kept teasing all of us whenever the conversation became too serious. And I began spending more afternoons at the 5-acre property, clearing weeds, planning the orchard, and deciding which parts of the old storage building could be repaired rather than replaced. One Saturday morning, Melissa arrived alone carrying 2 cups of coffee. She found me sitting on an overturned bucket beside one of the apple trees we had planted. "I thought you might be here," she said. "Your brother is coming later with lumber." She handed me a cup and sat beside me on another bucket. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The October air was cool enough for jackets, and leaves moved across the field whenever the wind picked up. Finally, Melissa said, "Jason and I paid off one of the smaller credit cards yesterday." "That must feel good." "It does." The balance was not huge, but closing it felt different from buying something new. I smiled. Progress is often less exciting than purchasing. Nobody posts a picture of a zero balance on social media. Maybe that is why people underestimate it. She laughed, then looked across the property. "I have been thinking about something you said. About buying freedom before appearances. I remember. I think I spent years doing the opposite." She told me that when she and Jason bought their house, they qualified for more than they originally planned to spend. The larger house impressed them, so they convinced themselves they would grow into the payment. Then came furniture appropriate for the larger rooms, landscaping, renovations, and vehicles that looked suitable beside the house. Each decision seemed manageable by itself. Together, they had created a lifestyle that demanded almost every dollar they earned. "We were not pretending to have money," she said. "We really do earn good money." "I know." That almost made it worse. Every raise became permission to spend more. That happens easily. She looked at me. "Why did you never tell me I was making a mistake? Would you have listened?" She thought about it. "Probably not." "Then there is your answer." "But you must have worried." "Of course I worried. I am your mother. Worrying is practically part of the job description." She smiled. "Dad would have said something. Your father did say things. You called him old-fashioned." Melissa covered her face briefly. "I remember. He was not offended. How do you know? Because afterward he told me that everybody has to pay tuition to experience. She laughed so loudly that a bird flew from the nearby fence. That sounds exactly like him. Daniel arrived before noon with lumber strapped into the bed of his pickup. Jason followed about 20 minutes later in the used vehicle he and Melissa had bought after selling the expensive sport utility vehicle. Nobody mentioned the change anymore. It was simply their car now. We spent the afternoon repairing damaged boards on the storage building. I mostly carried smaller pieces, handed over tools, and made sandwiches. By late afternoon, the building looked less abandoned. Jason stood back and studied it. You know, 6 months ago I would have told you to tear this down and build something new. I know. Now I am wondering what another coat of paint can accomplish. Daniel laughed. Mom has converted him. No, I said. His credit card statements converted him. Jason laughed too. That mattered. He could finally talk about his mistakes without defending them. Before everyone left, he pulled me aside. Can I tell you something without Melissa hearing it from you first? As long as it is not something she should know. She knows the important part. I just want to surprise her with the result. He explained that he had started selling several pieces of expensive recreational equipment he rarely used. The money would go toward their remaining consumer debt. I kept telling myself those things proved I was enjoying what I earned, he said. Then I realized I was making payments on things I barely touched. That realization is worth something. I also turned down another investment opportunity this week. Because it was bad. I do not know. Maybe it was excellent. But I finally asked a different question. Which one? Not whether I could make money from it. Whether I needed it. I nodded. That question has saved me a lot of money. He smiled. I am starting to understand. By Thanksgiving, their financial situation was not magically repaired, but it was improving. The credit card balances were falling. Their emergency savings had stopped shrinking. Most importantly, Melissa told me they were sleeping better. We gathered at my house that year because I insisted. My kitchen was smaller than Melissa's, my dining table had scratches, and we had to bring in 2 folding chairs from the garage. Nobody seemed embarrassed by any of it. After dinner, Daniel found an old photograph album in the living room cabinet. Soon everyone was looking through pictures from years when Robert and I were raising the children. There was our first little house. Our old station wagon. Camping trips. Birthday cakes made at home. Robert standing beside the ridiculous fishing boat. Melissa held up one photograph of our family sitting outside a rented cabin in Tennessee. I remember this vacation, she said. I thought that cabin was enormous. It had 2 bedrooms, I said. And 1 bathroom, Daniel added. We survived. Jason studied the photograph. Everybody looks happy. We were, I said. He looked around my living room, then toward the dining table where the remains of Thanksgiving dinner still waited to be cleared. I spent a long time thinking success was something people should be able to see. Melissa rested her hand on his shoulder. So did I. I looked at the photograph of Robert smiling beside our children and realized how much of our life could never have been measured by an account balance anyway. The money mattered because security mattered. But it had never been the purpose of everything. Your father understood something I nearly forgot after he died, I said. Money is supposed to support your life. Your life is not supposed to become a performance designed to prove you have money. Daniel raised his coffee cup. That sounds like another dad quote. No, I said. That one is mine. Everyone laughed. Later, after the dishes were finished and the house had grown quiet, Melissa stayed behind for a few minutes. At the front door, she hugged me and whispered, "Mom, I am proud of you." Months earlier, those words might have felt like the victory I wanted. Instead, I held her tighter and said, "I am proud of you too." Because somewhere between the bank office and that scratched dining table, the question had stopped being whether my family finally understood that I was successful. What mattered was that they were beginning to understand what success was for themselves. By early spring, the 2 apple trees we planted had survived their first Ohio winter, and so had something else I once feared might not recover so easily, the respect inside our family. The changes were not perfect. Jason still loved discussing business opportunities, and Melissa still occasionally caught herself comparing their home to someone else's. I still clipped coupons when the savings were worth the trouble, and my 12-year-old sedan remained in my driveway. The difference was that nobody treated those things as evidence anymore. One Saturday in April, Melissa and Jason invited Daniel and me to dinner. Their house looked different, although it took me a few minutes to understand why. Nothing major had been removed. It simply felt quieter. There were no new purchases waiting to be admired, no conversation about renovations, and no explanation of what something had cost. After dinner, Jason brought a folder to the table. "I have something to show you," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "If this is another commercial property, I am leaving." Daniel laughed. "I will drive you." Jason smiled. "No investment." He opened the folder and placed a single page in front of Melissa. She stared at it, then covered her mouth. "You did it?" "This morning." "What happened?" I asked. Melissa turned the page toward me. It was a statement showing that the last of their high-interest credit card balances had been paid. "We still have the mortgage and 1 vehicle loan," Jason said, "but the cards are gone." "Congratulations." "It took months," Melissa said. "And selling things we should never have financed in the first place." Jason nodded. "I sold the last piece of recreational equipment last week." Daniel leaned back. "I never thought I would see the day." Neither did the guy who bought it. "He got a very good deal." We laughed, but Jason soon became serious. "There is something else. My business partner went ahead with that commercial property using another investor." I waited. "And?" "It is doing well." Melissa glanced at him, perhaps worried that regret was coming. Instead, Jason smiled. "A year ago, that would have bothered me. I would have spent months thinking about the money I missed. Now I look at our statements and realize I was not financially ready for that opportunity, even if the opportunity itself was good." "That is an important distinction," I said. "I learned it the expensive way." "Most useful lessons have tuition," I reminded him. Melissa laughed. "Dad again. Dad again." Later that month, Thomas invited me to the bank for my annual account review. We went through the usual documents, discussed required distributions in future years, reviewed beneficiaries, and checked whether anything in my financial plan needed adjustment. Near the end, Thomas closed the folder and smiled. "So, are you finally buying a new car?" "Why is everybody obsessed with my car?" "Because I saw you checking prices online while you were waiting." I laughed. "Maybe. That is practically reckless behavior for you. Do not tell Jason. He will think he has won." The truth was simpler. My sedan was still reliable, but I had begun considering replacing it within the next year. Not because anyone had shamed me into it, but because I wanted newer safety features and greater comfort on longer drives. That distinction mattered. Frugality was useful only when it served my life. I had spent months teaching my family not to confuse spending with success, and I did not want to make the opposite mistake by confusing deprivation with wisdom. Before I left, Thomas said something that stayed with me. "You know, Evelyn, the day your family was here, I worried I had spoken too strongly." "You did speak strongly. I hope appropriately. You stood up for me. When I had spent too much time allowing other people to define me. You did not need me to defend your finances." "No. But I needed someone to interrupt the story they had written about me." He nodded. "People trust visible evidence. Even when it tells them almost nothing. Especially then." I drove from the bank to the 5-acre property. The storage building had been repaired and painted. The orchard had grown from 2 trees to 12. Daniel had built several raised garden beds, and Melissa had planted herbs along the southern edge. Jason had installed a simple rainwater collection system after researching it for weeks. Robert would have loved every inch of the place. I walked to the first apple tree and found tiny green leaves opening along its branches. A year earlier, I might have looked at that land and thought primarily about what it represented financially. Now it represented something larger. It was proof that patience could eventually become possibility. That afternoon, Melissa arrived carrying sandwiches. We sat beneath the maple trees and watched clouds move across the field. "Mom," she said, "do you remember what I said at that lunch?" "I remember. I asked what you had to show for all those years." "You did." She looked embarrassed. "I wish I could take it back." "Do not." She looked at me. "Why?" "Because you learned something from saying it. At your expense. For a little while." She looked across the property. "I thought the answer would be money. The paid-off house, the investments, this land. Those things matter. But that is not really the answer, is it?" I smiled. "What do you think the answer is?" She considered it. "You built a life where you could say no." I waited. No to debt you did not need. No to buying things just to impress people. No when Jason wanted your assets involved in his plans. And yes when you actually wanted something. I felt my throat tighten. Your father would have liked that answer. Melissa rested her head briefly against my shoulder. "I think I finally understand why you never defended yourself at first. I was not ashamed of my life. Even when we were. Especially then." Several months later, I did replace my car. I bought a comfortable 3-year-old sedan with low mileage and paid for it without financing. When I drove it to Melissa's house for the first time, Jason walked outside, stared at it, and grinned. "Evelyn Carter bought another car. I need photographic evidence. Do not make me return it." He laughed and opened the passenger door. "Very nice." Then he asked the question that showed me how much had changed. Not how much it cost. Not whether I could afford something newer. Not why I had waited so long. He simply asked, "Are you happy with it?" I looked at my daughter, my son-in-law, Daniel standing in the doorway behind them, and the ordinary life I had once been told was too small to represent success. "Yes," I said. "I am." And that was finally enough.